My name is Rob Larity. I'm the founder of Cognitive Investments. I'm here with Jacob Shapiro, who's the director of geopolitical analysis. Let's get started. Jacob, a lot of people who are going to be here listening to this today in our CI circle are people who are in Chile, who have assets in Chile or family in Chile, and they're worried about what's going on. So why don't you start by taking a step back from the day-to-day of the political situation and just giving us your big picture geopolitical analysis of what's happening in Chile right now. And I think a good way to start would be, what is geopolitical analysis in the first place? What does that mean?
Thanks, Rob, and it's good to be with you all. Yeah, geopolitics is one of these buzzwords that's getting thrown around all the time, and it can mean a bunch of different things to a lot of different people. I think a lot of, the Wall Street Journal, it's in the headlines every other day. But for me, geopolitics is a discipline based on a really deceptively simple idea. And it's the idea that states always pursue survival and power within the limits of their geography. I know that sounds simple, but when you actually start applying that, it gets a lot more complex. Most of human behavior at a national level is driven by our desire for realization and growth. For the way that we love our families and love our own, the way that we fear anyone that might attack our families or the things that we love. These basic instincts, whether they're conscious or not, drive a state's behavior. Now, note that this doesn't mean that states always behave in their best interest. Think of all of us as individuals. I'm sure some of us, all the time, we do things that aren't in our best interest. I just got into a fight with my wife an hour ago about the paint color in our house. I can assure you that wasn't in my best interest because I'm a moron. Sometimes we just do things reflexively, right? To make it more serious, think of the fight or flight reflex, where if something happens that's threatening you, your body sort of immediately takes over. It tells you what you need to do because it's sensing threats. Geopolitics applies that sort of thinking to the behavior of nation states. It says that we can understand states and how they're going to behave based on rigorous analysis of those types of intangible forces. Now, this doesn't mean that geopolitics dismisses things like political ideologies, cultural values, religious principles. It just means that geopolitics doesn't take a stand one way or another on those things. It tries to describe the world as it is and will be, not as I might want it to be or as you might want it to be. So before we start and get really into Chile, I want everyone who's listening to this to just know how fastidious, how neurotic I am about not making value judgments. I'm using geopolitics here as a tool to offer us objective insights into how Chile behaves and what I think its future is. I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, whether that's good or bad. I'm trying to describe what is and what will be. I'm going to make an argument to you now that might be surprising about why I think Chile is actually sitting in a really, really good position right now. Chile obviously has a lot of short-term political volatility and uncertainty ahead of that. The folks listening to this call know that a lot better than I do sitting here in New Orleans. But my perspective outside of Chile, and as someone without a personal attachment to the country, is what gives me the freedom to look at its situation dispassionately. And I have to tell you, very, very few countries in history, let alone in the world today, I really mean in history, enjoy the kind of favorable geopolitical situation that Chile does today. And that sounds very impressive, maybe even hyperbolic. What do I mean by that? I mean very simply that Chile is one of the few countries in the world that has achieved all of its geopolitical imperatives. Now, geopolitical imperatives, that's a fancy word for the things that a country must do in order to survive. They are the most important goals a nation pursues, whether consciously or unconsciously. Very, very few countries achieve all of their geopolitical imperatives. The United States is actually an example of one that has done that. Once the United States neutralized Mexico and Canada as potential threats, and developed a navy strong enough to protect it from external powers, it didn't have to worry about the things that most states have to worry about. It could focus its energy on acquiring more wealth, making more scientific discoveries, becoming more powerful. When you achieve those geopolitical imperatives, you have the space, the energy, the bandwidth to do that sort of expansion. Now, Chile is a much smaller country than the United States, obviously, but it has also achieved all of its basic geopolitical imperatives. So I want to start here by turning to a couple maps rather than just looking at my face to help you explain and understand how and why. We'll start with this map of the entire South American continent with no political boundaries drawn on it. Now you can see that the Andes Mountains basically run down the western edge of South America, almost like the spine of a book. To the west of the Andes are some very narrow strips of fertile land that are separated from each other by desert or by other inhospitable zones. And to the east of the Andes, we've got these broad, fertile, green landscapes centered around two main river systems, the Rio de la Plata in the south and the huge Amazon river system in the north. Now think about your history. It is not a coincidence that the great civilizations of South America that we all learn about in school when we grow up, before the Spanish and the Portuguese came and colonized, were all located west of the Andes. The great Incan empires, they're west of the Andes. The Aztecs, the Mayans, they're primarily Central and North American empires. They're not South American empires. That geography east of the Andes that looks so nice, and so green, so full of rivers, it's almost too good. Because what happens there is you get lots of smaller communities that are based around those rivers or those tributaries. And a lot of those communities are competing with each other constantly for resources. They're spending their time and their energy thinking about how to protect their relatively indefensible lot in life from the folks that could threaten to take it away. When we're west of the Andes, even though there's a lot less land to work with here, it's where you can actually be secure from a national security perspective. This land is incredibly defensible. It is hard to get to, and the areas that support large-scale human communities are large enough to support large groups, but not so large as to be ungovernable. It's a really nice, happy medium. Let's look at the second map here, which shows us the elevation of the mountain ranges in South America to really drive this point home. On this map, the Andes stick out so much, you can barely see Chile on it, but that's the whole point. Chile is truly isolated from most of its neighbors. Now, you would think that a long, skinny country is in danger of being attacked on all sides, but it's precisely the opposite for Chile. Its unique shape means it can defend itself relatively easily from a potential Argentine threat to the south, or maybe a Peruvian threat to the north. Otherwise, Chile gets to sleep very easily at night. Chile really has 3 to 4 geopolitical imperatives, depending on how you look at it. The first is that Chile has to expand to its natural defensible borders. What that means is that it has to extend to the Atacama Desert in the north and to Patagonia in the south. And once Chile expands to these borders, it is in a very naturally defensible position. Middle Chile, which is that area around Santiago, which is where 60% of the population lives, even though it's just 12% of the country's territory, is secure from potential threats once Chile achieves this imperative. Now, second, Chile has to secure the coast. And that means Chile, smaller than many of the countries that are around it, has to build a stronger navy than anyone else in the region and then project that naval power. And that has literally been true of Chile since it became the strongest navy in the region after the War of the Pacific in the 19th century. I think people forget about these things because it was so long ago. That's how long ago Chile achieved some of these imperatives that we're talking about. The third imperative is that Chile has to make sure that Argentina to the south and Peru and Bolivia to the north are not able to challenge its position, whether by ganging up with other powers or increasing their own resources. And Chile has managed to achieve this imperative without really having to do a whole lot because it's surrounded on all sides by political and economic disasters. We'll talk more about Chile's political stability later, but keep in mind who Chile is competing with. Argentina could pose a very real threat to Chile, but it can't even pay its own debts, let alone field the kind of economic or political or military force that would threaten Chile in the long term. Peru has a real communist for a president who really means it when he wants to nationalize industry and do all these things to the economy that everyone is scared of, as opposed to a student leader who gives speeches about fiscal responsibility. That's not happening in Peru. I don't think we really have to go into Bolivia at length. It's been a colossal dumpster fire for a while now. Let's move in though to a chart to show us the most important imperative and the thing that actually worries me the most if I'm Chile. And that's that Chile has to protect its foreign trade routes. This map or chart that we've got up right now is the countries to which Chile exports and their share in Chilean exports. The yellow and green is a greater share, the purple is smaller shares. The real risk for Chile is that as a result of its unique geography, it's completely dependent on foreign trade if it wants to scale its economy. It's secure, but it has to be able to interact with the rest of the world. And because it's located so far away from the rest of the world, it has to trade over extremely long distances. So when you look at who Chile trades with, you see that the US and China are its top export destinations. You also just see that there's really not a country in the world that Chile isn't trading with, which is pretty incredible. This is why, though, during times of great power competition, we're just at the beginning of an era of great power competition, you have to be a little nervous if you're Chile, because Chile has an imperative not to get caught in great power competition. From a geopolitical perspective, that's what the 1970s and all of the political disruption in Chile were really all about. Chile found itself, like several Latin American countries, caught and mixed up in the Cold War, and it had foreign powers that were messing around on the ground, affecting its politics. Chile had a very brief taste of this during the Trump administration. I think if the Trump administration had remained in office and continued its hardline approach with Chile to weaken its relationship with China, that would have posed a much greater geopolitical threat than any of the political challenges posed by Boric or any of the current political instability we're seeing. You might as well, if you're going to go to Chile and say you're not allowed to build a subsea cable to connect Chile to Asia and make Chile a digital hub for Latin America, if you go to Chile and say you can't deal or trade with China or have China build out your 5G network or have Huawei be part of building out your 5G network, you might as well be telling Chile to give up its independence, which is exactly what the US was doing under the Trump administration. In that sense, I think a country to think of as an analog to Chile is Australia. Chile and Australia they share a lot in common. They're both in the Pacific. They are both trading nations whose sort of the circulatory system of their economy exists almost outside of their bodies, if you will. The difference is that Australia's chosen a side in great power competition because it has a really unique and tight relationship with the United States. But the United States isn't going to offer Chile nuclear sub-technology. It's not going to share intelligence with Chile. It's not going to support the Chilean economy the way that the US does with Australia. So for Chile, it's all about keeping its trading options open. It wants to be an easy place to trade with. If trade starts breaking down, the Chilean economy doesn't work anymore. It has to export products abroad, and then it also still has to import a significant amount of oil. Now, luckily for Chile, it has products that most of the rest of the world not only want, but desperately need. Now, the first is copper, of course. Chile has the largest copper reserves in the world by almost a 2-to-1 margin. It's also the top copper producer in the world. And copper has been in a long positive cycle due mainly to China's insatiable demand as part of its construction drive and its build to build out infrastructure. Now, there's some good news and bad news here. The bad news is that China's running out of steam. We think that the Chinese economy is slowing down relatively more than most folks out there are predicting, because we think they have to harmonize some of the inefficiencies that have sprung up in the last 20 years. But the good news is that all of the environmentally friendly technology that everyone in the investment world is obsessed with relies to some degree on copper. So whether we're talking about electric cars, offshore wind, solar, nuclear, even new coal plants and natural gas generation plants, you have to have copper for all of those things to work. And the reason the global price of copper has performed so well since the pandemic is because there's demand for copper, and I think we're just getting started there. I'm very bullish about copper demand in the future. And now Chile also has a lot of another important mineral commodity that is going to be in very high demand in the decade ahead for similar reasons, which is lithium. The lands that Chile won in the War of the Pacific keep on giving. So again, Chile has the largest reserves of lithium in the world, this time by a 4-to-1 margin. It's only the second largest producer. Australia is winning the title there. But if Chile ever was able to scale, it's going to be a lithium superpower. Brazil and Peru obviously have sizable lithium deposits of their own, but there's really no country like Chile that has this mineral wealth ready to go. And the thing to keep in mind is that this is a lot of wealth. It's a lot more wealth than most countries even dream of ever having. There's a reason that copper and lithium have become such contentious issues in Chilean politics. You can choose to look at that glass half empty, that the government is going to fight and squabble over this, and it's going to be bad for business and bad for mining. Or you can recognize most countries would be killing to have this kind of problem, would be absolutely loving to be having these conversations about how to divvy up this resource wealth and how to make it work for Chile. The nice thing about this all too, and this brings us to our last chart, is that Chile is already starting from a pretty good place. When you look at GDP per capita by purchasing power parity, Chile is the wealthiest country in South America. It's the richest one. It's also one of the only countries in the region that can even try to be energy independent in the next decade or so. There is not a country on the planet that is better suited for solar power than Chile due to the Atacama Desert. So Chile has the potential not just of being a major mineral exporter to the world, of being this digital hub that connects Asia to South America directly rather than having to go through US networks, but also even of achieving energy independence and becoming one of the first countries in the world to do that. That's going to take time, it's going to take investment, it's going to be contentious, but these are all realistic goals for Chile. For most countries, they can't even dream of trying to achieve these goals. Now, notice I've been talking now for a while, probably for too long, and I haven't once mentioned politics or ideology or communism or Augusto Pinochet or anything else. And I don't want to dismiss those things, and we're going to get into them, and I expect it'll occupy most of the question and answer part of this session. But the discipline of geopolitics is really to focus on the things that matter. And what really matters is that Chile simply just enjoys a lot of advantages that other countries don't. I think that's a big part of the reason why Chile is so much different than almost every other country in Latin America. Chile has gone through its difficult periods. All countries go through difficult periods. It's going through another difficult one right now. But compared to Chile's neighbors, heck, compared to most states in the world, Chile has incredibly strong, resilient, and democratic institutions. I can think of very few countries in the world today that could react to those 2019 protests the way that Chile has. Let's just think about it for a second. Chile didn't expel its president, and the president didn't try to stay in power. Even when a pandemic delayed things and threw everything into uncertainty, the country still elected a constitutional convention and is debating the finer points of that constitution now. It's raucous, it's contentious, but that's what democracies are. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. Chile also held a presidential election. It was a highly contentious presidential election, and there was basically no violence. The challenger who lost gracefully conceded when it was all over. I can't even say that about my own country here in the United States anymore. Not only that, but the government that has been elected is fairly evenly split. If you look at Boric on the campaign trail, he moderated his views. And that's because the way to get attention in Chile is still to appeal to the center, to build a broad coalition, not to silo into factions. When we look at the choices for Boric's cabinet, I see moderates and I see pragmatists. Mario Marcel is not the type of person you put in charge of the finance ministry if you're a communist looking for global revolution. It's if you're somebody who wants to be a steward to the economy and incrementally make things better and change things in the long term. So what I would leave you with is that Chile really is an exceptional country relative to its neighbors. And the things that make Chile unique, which is those strong institutions, its relative wealth, are also the source of its inequality and its current political disagreements. And all of these things, they're all products of Chile's geography. And as we move towards a more multipolar world, Chile really has several advantages going for it that most countries don't. And I think that those advantages will outweigh this current instability that we're dealing with, no matter who's in charge of the country. To put it into concrete terms, for Chile to fail, it would have to turn into Argentina. And while I think I have a pretty active imagination, I can't imagine Chile falling that far. So that's the reason I'm bullish on Chile right now from a geopolitical perspective.
So that's great, Jacob. So you talked about the big picture things, the long-term advantages that Chile has that don't change. I guess the counter argument to what you said would be, okay, something has clearly changed since 2019, that there's been some equilibrium in Chile that has held for 30 years, and that appears to be breaking or has broken in some way, which is why people are concerned. How does that challenge your thesis, based on this much more longer term fundamental view?
Thanks, Ra. And you're right, something has changed. It's not all flowers and cookies and everybody's drinking wine and everything's very happy. But I think this is more about Chile outgrowing the past. You can look at this kind of political unrest that Chile is going through, and sometimes it can be a sign that politically a country is entering a decline, that it's deteriorating, and that it won't be able to continue to be the country that it was before. Sometimes, though, that instability is actually a marker of progress. Because again, nothing in politics is static. It's not like you reach a point where everybody is happy and everybody is wealthy and everything is going to be perfect. Nothing is ever going to be perfect, ever. So I think what happened with Chile was that it enjoyed a tremendous amount of success over the last 20 to 30 years. It really outperformed everybody else in the region. And that success has Chileans looking at each other saying, okay, we've achieved this success. The way our government is structured, the way that we're dealing with this thing, it doesn't fit. Because even as we have this really, really high GDP per capita, we also have one of the highest inequality rates in the OECD. We certainly have one of the highest inequality rates in the region itself. So we're doing something right and people are profiting, but that's not being distributed equitably. And it's not being, it's not in such a way that all of Chileans are enjoying in that success. So I think all the fundamentals, those important things that don't change, those are all still in place. What Chile has done is that it has the self-confidence as a nation to say, you know what, like this all served us very well, but if we're going to continue going forward in the future, and if we're going to do the things that are best for Chile, we're going to have to make some major changes. And the way that it's going about making those changes, to me, signals a country that is really in charge of its own destiny rather than being subject to things that to political forces that it's not able to control. So I do think that something has changed in that social contract, but for me, it's a positive that Chile is talking about that and can have change. It can do that in a relatively orderly process where most countries wouldn't be able to do that.
So we have the inauguration coming up about a month from now. And whenever we have a thesis here at Cognitive Investments, we lay out what are the things we'd be looking for to determine that we're wrong. What would disprove our analysis? What would disprove our thesis? When you look specifically at the politics, Boric is coming into office. What are you going to be looking for to see, as in terms of flags that would signal that something's gone wrong, that these issues that you're identifying are breaking down and something fundamentally has changed?
Yeah, and this is in many ways is the most important part of this entire presentation, because if a thesis like mine is not falsifiable, it's not a thesis. That means I'm out here, just selling something and not actually something tangible that we can test. There are a couple things, and some of them are more immediate and political, and some of them are still kind of long-term. So I don't see that the Chilean government is going after nationalizing the country's resources. I see increased regulation, I see increased taxes, I see, they're discussing ways that they want to manage their mineral wealth. But if we start talking about nationalization, if the Constitution is getting reformed in such a way that nationalization is on the table and we're only having state-owned mining companies and things like that, I'm wrong. That would be a sign that Chile is not being moderate and that it's actually going in the direction and in the mistaken direction, I would say, that some of the other countries around it have. I would also say that if we see the Chilean government turning against trade deals, so whether it's the Pacific Alliance, whether it's Chile's participation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if Chile starts imposing protectionist trade measures rather than doing everything it can to grease the wheels of Chilean trade abroad, that would be a major red flag for me. And that's the sort of stuff that if you look in Peru or you look in Argentina, when you get these true protectionist communist governments, that's what it looks like. They don't want to trade on an equal basis. They want to be able to protect things and build up those industries in an artificial way. I don't see that in Chile at all right now. And if I did start to see that, I would start to question myself. And then another sort of short-term political thing, if as we get into the constitutional process, we're talking about getting rid of checks and balances in the Chilean government. If, for instance, we're giving the president of Chile much more powers than he has currently. And somebody like that would be able to force through reforms without having to compromise, without having to reach across the aisle. If we started getting radicalization and factionalization of Chilean politics, that would be of some concern too. I would say, though, two other things to keep in mind that have nothing to do with the political situation is, number one, if we're wrong about copper, if global copper prices start to fall, or if demand for copper is not as much as we think, or if somebody tomorrow invents something that makes copper obsolete, that would be very bad for Chile, and it would invalidate large portions of my thesis. I would also be looking very closely at foreign direct investment. Rob, I know you're probably going to talk a little bit about capital outflows, but when you look at foreign direct investment into Chile, it's up. It's up something like 60% last year, and the pandemic skews figures. So, talking year by year in the short term is kind of weird. But even if you go back comparing foreign direct investment this past year to, say, 2015, 2016, it's up. So I know there are folks who are scared and there's a lot of political uncertainty on the ground, but outsiders are still investing in Chile, and they see these fundamentals and they're not scared off, and they feel like they have a good handle on it. So if we saw foreign direct investment going the opposite direction, that would be a clear indicator to me that something is off. So those are 5 key signposts that I'll be watching. There may be more, but for me, those are the most important ones. And that might actually be a good segue, Rob, into sort of how you think about this from an investment perspective and how to protect wealth in the context of some of what's going on.
Yeah, so I'll keep that part brief because people are here to hear about politics more than economics and markets. But anyone who wants to have a more detailed discussion can contact us or contact myself or Daniela directly. We're happy to speak with you about it. So just to be clear, Cognitive has been buying Chilean stocks and buying the Chilean peso for its clients really since the end of last year. And we started picking that up in late December after the election results came in, and all of the Western press was having a panic attack about the results of the election, and Boric, and he's a communist and he has a mohawk, and oh my goodness, this is a big problem. And really, our thesis can be summarized very simply in 2 charts. So this first chart shows, Jacob mentioned foreign direct investment. This chart shows portfolio investment. This is the liquid capital, the cash, the stocks, the bonds flowing in and out of Chile. And what you can see here, so numbers above 0 is capital flowing into the country. Numbers below 0 is capital coming out of the country. And what this shows is this is the picture of fear. And if you look at how things have progressed recently, you can see that the outflows of capital, of liquid capital, have accelerated, even while, as Jacob pointed out, actual businesses, foreign direct investment has increased during that time period. So this is Chileans who are taking their money out of the country. This is foreign investors who are reading things like The Economist, and in the light of the election results, panicking, getting worried about Chile, getting out, right? And based on this, you can see by coming in and buying the peso, by buying Chilean stocks right now, we're really going against the grain, right? And why is that? Why do we feel confident and comfortable making that bet? Well, that brings us to this other chart. And I think if I had to summarize Chile and all its markets and economy and economic variables right now, this would be the chart that I would point to. So here you have in red, this is the price of copper going back to 2002. And in blue, you have the value of the Chilean peso against the dollar. So you can see, as Jacob mentioned, copper is 50% of Chile's exports. So in many ways, you can look at this price of copper and it's a proxy for everything going right or wrong in Chile at any time. And if you were to look at GDP growth or wealth or all sorts of measures, it generally corresponds to this copper price. And it's really extraordinary because you can see how closely these two have moved together for years and years. And in the early 2000s, they both boomed during the Chinese-driven commodity cycle. And then when copper peaked in 2011, the peso peaked and growth slowed down in Chile. Commodity prices fell. You can see that capital inflows turned into outflows for quite a long time. There was a long slowdown and a long recession. So the interesting thing that's happened since then is this divergence. So if you look since the beginning of 2020, we've seen a resurgence in copper prices, a big resurgence. And after 10 years of copper rolling over, it looks like we're starting the beginning of a new bull cycle in copper and commodities in growth. And the noteworthy thing is, in late 2019, when you first saw the protests in Santiago, when you first saw these issues emerge that Jacob has spoken about, that's when you get this divergence. And copper prices go up and the peso collapses because everyone is panicking. And this here is your cloud of fear. This is a visual manifestation of the fear that all Chileans with money and wealth feel right now. And our analysis, our bet is that if we're right on the fundamentals of the economy are improving. There's no doubt about that, as you can see in this red line. And if we're right, then in the coming months and in the coming year, as Boric comes into office, as he's forced to moderate his positions, and if Jacob's core thesis is correct, that these longer term advantages of Chile are going to be sort of the lodestar to which policy ultimately moves, then we should see this cloud of fear dispel, and the peso, Chilean asset prices, all sorts of liquid measures of wealth in Chile should revert back upwards, and revert back upwards with a vengeance. So that's what we're betting on, and you're already starting to see that. So this is, there's been quite a bounce in the peso and in Chilean stocks since the election. So that's really the big move that we're playing for. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll get into Q&A. Why don't we do that and see? Okay, Jacob, so first question, have you seen the last guidelines the Constituent Assembly committees are proposing? The end of the judiciary system independence, termination of contracts performed in huge extensions of indigenous lands. They don't seem to contribute to stability and growth. What do you think about that?
It's a great and really important question. The first thing I would say is just remember, writing a constitution is a really, really hard process. If you go back and actually read, for example, what was happening in the United States when all these guys that now everybody talks about is great, Jefferson, Adams, and Washington, when they're writing the Constitution, there was so much yelling at each other and so many terrible things that people were saying to each other and so many crazy ideas that never actually made it. So I think it's really important to look at those proposals. It's much more important to see what gets passed, and then it's even more important to see what gets put to a vote to the Chilean people. So I would say, don't read too much into it yet. I think we're still in that process where things are being hammered out. Some of the things that are on the table, they disturb me and go against some of the thesis that I've been laying out here. My bet is that Chile's political institutions are going to moderate those things. So if you do get some of these things that are crazy or that do challenge the balance of power or the checks and balances of the Chilean government, that by the time they came to a vote for the Chilean people, they would not resemble the sort of headline story that people are making out just because however many thousands of people signed a petition that they wanted that thing discussed in the Constitutional Assembly. So if we get to the point where the Constitution is being put to a referendum and it contains some of those things, and if Chileans then pass that referendum, then you're absolutely right, I'm wrong, but I wouldn't view some of the crazier things coming out of the convention as necessarily as breaking the thesis. I view that as something to watch very closely and to use that to calibrate where we are on our thesis.
Another question here on the wealth tax. So a wealth tax has been proposed. I think it's 1.5%, something in that region. does that represent a fundamental break with the past? Is that a challenge to your thesis in itself if it passes?
I'm not sure that a wealth tax in and of itself is a challenge to my thesis, but I think it's really about how and why is it being passed. So, for example, the lower house, the Chamber of Deputies, surprised everyone by sort of passing a 1.5% or 2.5% wealth tax in January. But that was part of trying to fund Piñera's pension system, and they're going to challenge it in court. And it's not even clear that any of it's legal. I also don't think a wealth tax by itself is indicative of something that's gone wrong, especially where you have so much wealth inequality. I'm not sure that if it were me, I wouldn't want to be wealth taxed, and I'm not sure a wealth tax is what I would recommend. But wealth inequality is a problem in Chile, and Chile is going to have to do something about wealth inequality if it's going to create a system that everybody buys into. So it would actually be more of a concern to me if we weren't talking about wealth inequality, if everybody was sweeping it under the rug and just pretending like it wasn't a problem. So again, this is one of those things where we have to watch how it develops, because it hasn't happened yet, and I don't even think it's likely to happen anytime soon. But it's there, and it's a major issue. And if we start seeing a serious wealth tax getting a groundswell of populist support, and if it's a really restrictive wealth tax that goes beyond just a one-time thing, and if it isn't part of a broader strategy to reduce inequality, it's just a thing to make the electorate happy, to make them feel like you're giving them bread and circuses, that would be very bad. If a wealth tax is part of a broader plan to reduce inequality so that Chile's economic growth can continue in a way that is more sustainable going forward, could arguably be a good thing. So I don't have a simple yes or no answer there. It's really about the how and the why. And if we get just a simple one-off, we're doing a wealth tax to make people happy, yeah, then I'm wrong and something is going on here. If it's part of that broader conversation, I might actually view it as fundamentally positive in the long term, even if in the short term, I would be worried about how I'm going to protect myself from some of those issues.
Yeah, so one of the participants in the meeting has pointed out, which I think is interesting, there's going to be many crazy proposals, this person says, and I can assure you they will not pass. And they point out that the fact that there are crazy proposals is a sign that it's democracy at work, that it's a sign of health of the Chilean democracy rather than the opposite. What do you make of that?
I mean, that's my fundamental thesis, said much more concisely and in some ways articulately than I've been able to this entire time. Really what we're talking about here and what I'm talking about here is that Chile has the types of institutions and the type of political climate that a country like Argentina or a country like Peru doesn't. I mean, Peru is a really instructive example, has a very, very similar economy to Chile in the sense that it has a lot of mineral wealth. It's got copper. It's got some of these big metals that everybody wants more of. And yet, in the last week, we've had 3 different Peruvian cabinets, I think, and Castillo can't even get basic things passed. And we're talking about the military calling out corruption, the police it's a total mess. Or look at Argentina, which is running around, can't pay the IMF back. It's trying to save pennies or pesos on the dollar there. It's batting its eyelashes at Russia and China at the one moment, going to the US, batting its eyelashes. They're playing very high risk stakes diplomacy. Chile has done none of that. And Chile arguably is going through a much more profound political transition than either of those countries. They're not rewriting their constitutions. They're not thinking about how wealth from these resources that they have is going to be equitably distributed for future generations. So it's really like, I know the grass is always greener on the other side, is something we say in the United States. But when you're looking at Chile, it may feel like it's crazy when you're in it. And there are some real factors with instability. But if you look at everything that's happening around it, nobody is dealing with things as measured a way as Chile is. And I expect that to continue going forward. And I honestly view Boric's election as part of that. The way that he's moderated himself, the things that he says, not what people say he thinks, the things that he actually says, his actual actions, that shows a pragmatist. That shows an incrementalist, somebody who's going to go step by step to try and realize some of these broader goals for Chile, not for somebody who's going to turn the whole thing over and change things at any kind of fundamental level.
And one final question that we're getting is just on the nationalization of assets. What are other comparative examples that you might point to? And how are you specifically going to be watching to see how likely that is to happen or not? Like, what are the signposts?
Well, the Boric administration, I mean, they have some principles down about what they want. They've been talking about using lithium to, whether is Chile going to own some of the resources? Is it going to be 50-50? We don't know the answers to these questions. These are things that are going to have to be worked out. And there are ways to do this. Saudi Arabia is one example. They nationalized all of their oil. They became very rich, but very unequal. Norway is maybe even a model that we might consider. They also had a bunch of oil, but they were able to balance, the preference for more social democratic measures and diversification of the economy, along with being able to spread that wealth more equitably. So there are a lot of different models out there, and it's going to be for Chile to decide for itself. What we don't want to see is Chile saying, okay, all of these private companies that are here mining copper, you're not going to be allowed to do that anymore. And the state is going to use profits and money so that it can prop up state champions who otherwise wouldn't be competitive with some of these private companies. We're not even going to allow private companies to do things in lithium. If you start seeing that kind of language, and if you start seeing proposals that are garnering serious support along those lines, then we're in a very different direction. But if what we're talking about is, and again, it's been very general terms, this is why this is one of the key signposts to watch, because we don't have as much data as we would want. But if we continue to talk about this in terms of regulation, in terms of maybe increased taxes, differences about where profit gets allocated and how it gets allocated, and what role the state has in that, what infrastructure the state is helping to build that to make sure, which is good for everyone. Those are all questions that don't make me nervous. Those are things that countries have to do all the time. And when you're about to go through a massive boom cycle and starting to mine a new element like lithium, you probably should recheck things, because if you don't put in that nice sublayer of structure, things are going to be really bad. So it's sort of, there's an old American Supreme Court justice joke about pornography, which is, you'll know it when you see it. Nationalization is like that. If you'll know it when you see it. If these mining companies start running for the hills, if the government starts talking about, as in Peru, about how the copper belongs to Chile and doesn't belong to anyone else, and we're going to increase taxes, and we're going to have these unprofitable state companies because it's a national security issue, that's the type of language, those are the types of proposals that would really challenge the thesis that I've laid out here.
And just to round back to the investment side for a moment. So as I mentioned, we're buying the peso, we're buying Chilean stocks for our clients, but you have to distinguish between the tactical and the strategic. That's a tactical move that we're doing because we have flexibility. We have the ability to get in and out. And as you can see, we monitor these situations very closely, and we're going to be watching what's being said next month, how things develop. Jacob laid out specific things he's going to be watching to determine whether his thesis is correct or not. And I just want to point out that if you are in Chile, you should be thinking about diversifying yourself when times are good, because as Jacob mentioned, Chile is very levered to a few small things, a few small factors. Like I showed this chart of copper prices. Copper is 50% of Chile's exports. And right now we're bullish on copper, but that could be very different 5 years from now. Personally, this is not the best comparison, but personally I've spent some time in Manaus in Brazil, which, if you know, back in the 1880s, 1890s, was one of the richest cities in Brazil, based entirely on rubber. And they have a beautiful Belle Epoque opera house that was built with the wealth from the rubber boom. And within 30 years, new rubber trees in Southeast Asia had completely decimated the rubber industry, and Manaus is now a ruin. And those wealthy, beautiful institutions, the mansions are still there. And that's an unfair comparison because they don't have the institutions that Chile does. But the fact remains, when you're very levered to one or two things, especially in an environment like Jacob said, it's a multipolar world. Trade is more fragile than it once was. It's important to think about the tactical and the strategic. And if you have all of your wealth in Chile, all of your wealth in Chilean businesses or Chilean real estate, you should think about how do you protect yourself. A few other questions actually coming in, Jacob. So is dependence on China growing? China seems to be actively courting Chile. Are there any risks here?
Yes, so there are risks here, and dependence on China. I personally think dependence on China has probably plateaued because, like I said, I think Chinese demand is going to start decreasing. And one of the things we're talking about when we talk about a multipolar world is that you're going to have other countries, like say India, that Chile is going to want to forge tight relationships with. It's why one of the key signposts for me is that the Boric government continues pursuing free trade deals and doesn't threaten any of the current free trade agreements, because you have to diversify away from China. But yes, that's the biggest threat. If in 2024 you get, let's say Donald Trump became president again, I don't think that, but let's assume for the sake of argument for a second that happened. That would be a very big challenge for Chile because, like I said, I mean, Mike Pompeo came down to Chile and was lecturing Piñera like he was an errand boy about how Chile shouldn't have a relationship with China. And even if you diversify away from China, there's no way Chile can't have a relationship with China. It's the second largest economy in the world. It's going to be the largest soon, and it's going to consume a lot of this, even if I think the dependency has plateaued. So that's the key risk. Chile really has to thread the needle here, and it has to be that sort of trading country that has relationships with everyone. That's why when you hear people talk about Chile, they'll talk about it as the Switzerland of Latin America, the Australia of Latin America. What all these countries have in common, Australia not so much now because they've made a strategic decision here in the last couple of years, but those are all trading nations. Those are nations that don't care about ideology. What they care about is openness and about making sure that commerce can move. And Chile really has to make sure that it is not seen as going into one camp or the other. That's part of the reason that the trouble happened in the 1970s. So I think Chile can do that. I think it has a better chance of doing that than most other countries, in part because it is so far away. China is actively courting everybody in South America for lots of different reasons, but you're a long way away. You don't have to worry about China doing anything to you in the sense, and like Taiwan does, or even countries like the Philippines and things like that. But Chile does need to be thinking about how can we maintain neutrality in this great power competition, and how can we diversify our relationships away from just the United States and China and glam on to these middle powers or these rising powers that are going to consume our resources more and allow us to not depend so much on the two heavyweights.
And another question, if the approved constitution is much more disruptive and doesn't go along with your thesis, what do you recommend doing?
Well, Rob, that might be a question for you. For me, it's probably beyond my pay grade to tell you what to do inside your own country. I wouldn't presume to do so. But if the approved constitution is much more disruptive, then I'm wrong. And Rob, you might speak to the tactics of how you might have to course correct if that's true.
Well, I guess that gets back to the tactical and the strategic. Right now, probably things are going to be fine, but you don't want to bet everything on probably. And in the past, when you've seen periods of truly disruptive institutional change, where you have a lot of uncertainty, where you have unrest, generally speaking, what you've wanted to do is have the ability to be liquid, because timing and flexibility and liquidity are generally undervalued in these situations. And especially, I have to say, in Latin American countries where people tend to favor owning real estate, owning hard assets, owning farms. Those are very difficult to liquidate if things go poorly. So as a general recommendation, and I can't give specific recommendations because we work with individual people and need to take into account their individual circumstances. But generally speaking, I think hedging by getting more liquidity, not necessarily, as we said, we don't think this is a time to take your money and go buy a lot of dollars with it. We think the opposite is going to happen. We think from the Chilean perspective that the price of the dollar is likely to fall, not rise in the next 6 months. But having, even within, Chile itself, within peso terms, having more liquidity than you would otherwise, at the margin, if you can raise cash, that's a good thing, because we've laid out our analysis of the situation, what we think is the most likely outcome, but uncertainty and volatility across the whole world is rising right now. And that's a fact. And that's going to be the situation that we're living with for the next 30 to 50 years by our analysis. And that's why we do what we do here. That's why Jacob works with Cognitive Investments, because 20 years ago, you didn't need a geopolitical analysis team to figure out what to do with your money. Now, you have trade policy changing day to day. You have commodity prices exploding and then collapsing. You have pandemics shutting down whole sectors of the economy. You need to retain the flexibility to be reactive. And I think that would be the broadest recommendation that I would give, if asked to give a recommendation, would be go long liquidity, long flexibility, long nimbleness, because that's how you're going to survive and thrive no matter what happens. And we help our clients do that. And that's where we come in. And we have one final observation, or a question rather. One of the participants asks, why have we not taken into account, when we're analyzing Chile's long-term advantages, the quality of the wine? So Jake, I don't know if you want to address that hole in your argument, but it's a good point.
Well, it's a reason for me to come down as soon as I can. I think, I'm not sure it's a fundamental reason for success, but I look forward to toasting all of you in person relatively soon.
All right. Well, we'll leave it at that. The next date that we're going to be watching is the inauguration on March 10th. As we mentioned, we may or may not do another one of these, depending on what's happening. If something is happening that's of interest, we'll do another event. We'll update you. We know that friends and people in our circle are engaged in these matters and concerned about what's going on, and we're here to help. So if you have any questions, you want to follow up with us on any of this, you want to speak with Jacob, email us. You can email Jacob directly, jacob@cognitive.investments. You can email me, it's just rob@cognitive.investments. And we're happy to be here as a resource for you. So thank you again. Thank you, Jacob.
I'm going to go get some of that Chilean wine, Rob.